Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. While you're here, please hit like and subscribe. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Alex Storer, author of a new book about one of my favorite albums. And I'll let you guess what the album is when I tell you the title. Inside Outside, the deconstruction of David Bowie's Gothic hypercycle. So if you didn't guess, it's a book about Outside, which indeed is one of my favorite albums. Alex, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi John, it's good to be here and thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been waiting to have this conversation with you because I've known that this book has been in the works. So let me ask you this question. I've been fortunate enough for you to share with me that advanced copy. But for those who haven't seen it yet, what is the book about?
Well, yeah, as you can guess, it's about the making of Outside, but it's not. It covers quite a wide. Um, it covers that whole period really. The whole run up to Outside, where Bowie was at the end of the '80s, at the start of the '90s, and how he got to the point where he was ready to make what was then the Leon project. Which, as I've discovered through my research, was not just an album, but a whole series of interesting things. But obviously, Leon evolved into Outside, and then we had the tour, which I still think was his very best. Made a huge impression on myself as a teenager. And yeah, it's always been one of my very favorite albums, and I felt it was really time we had. There's been very few books on this album, so I thought with the 30th anniversary having passed last year, it would be it's a labor of love, it's a real personal
Yeah,
project, which has been in my mind for a long time, and this is the right time for me to get it out. So it's a history of the making of the album,
yeah,
also covering the tour.
yeah. So there's a lot I wanted to talk to you about. Let me start with this. There's an interesting uh, quote from the book that I thought really spoke to one of the interesting features of the album, and you're going to see me reading it so I get it right, which is it's harder to attach personal meaning or interpretation to any of the songs compared to many other Bowie albums. And I sort of wanted to start there and ask you what you meant by that and what confronting that observation meant in terms of writing a book about the album.
I think, the challenge I've given myself is to write about what a lot of people, or perhaps the media, mainly the media, regard as one of Bowie's least successful or least popular albums. I think that's, in fan circles, it's a very different opinion. There's a lot of love for it, but it often gets overlooked. Even shiny new, great documentaries gloss over it entirely. Um, and I think part of the challenge is that it's not just a set of songs, it is a series of stories and spoken sections. And it's a harder album to get into. And I think, you look at Black Star, of which there are many similarities to Outside. And I think Black Star is a far more challenging, difficult album that really makes the listener work hard, in addition to the very, very deep and moving subject that is being dealt with, which obviously became more apparent in the days after its release. But you can listen to Black Star and you know that a lot of it is under the surface quite autobiographical. And you can listen to some of those lyrics and you can also put your own relation to them. Whereas with Outside, you can't do that with any of the songs. It's really, it's more like a film than an
Yeah.
album in that respect.
Yeah. What you sort of alluded to what was happening in Bowie's career at the time of the album, which was 1995 is when it came out. What was happening in the world at that time? Like, what's relevant about the timing of this album?
I think from looking at it from in the book, I'm looking at it more from the sort of perspective of the musical landscape of the time.
Yeah,
Because what he was proposing was something that really wasn't going to fit in. You'd got a lot of new genres, a lot of the Britpop movement here in the UK, and you'd got a lot of grunge and alt rock in the US, and other artists and genres that were breaking through. Even a lot of artists that were citing Bowie as a major influence, even if it wasn't apparent at all in their work. Um, but it was old Bowie, it was Hunky
yeah,
Dory, Ziggy Stardust. It was what he did in the 70s. Um, even back then in the mid 90s, because my own journey started in the early 90s. Uh, so for me, Outside was the first brand new Bowie album for me. So I was exploring his discography during that time and discovering albums. And there really wasn't the kind of today, the love and reverence for like Low War Heroes and even Lodger, they're up there among his best. Whereas back in 1995, my perception was that, they weren't. And, there were harder albums to get into. So I think back in 1994, 95, he was deliberately doing something that was not, you know, going with the flow of everything else.
yeah,
Concept albums were pretty much a thing of the past at that point. Very few artists, you know, risked putting them out. There'd been some successful concept-based stuff, I guess, like with Pink Floyd or Meatloaf or uh, those kind of artists that had put stuff out in the early 90s, but it was a bit of a dying trend. Yet Bowie and Eno both had a fondness for sort of concept-driven albums, and they really wanted to do that again. So I think they were deliberately finding as many opposites as possible. So
yeah.
at a time when you've got a lot of rock and new sort of rock genres breaking through, a lot of the electronica stuff was really getting pushed further out back then. So what he was proposing was really, it was putting something very odd in the mix, I think.
So you mentioned concept, and I want to ask you what's the concept or what is the album about? But before we do that, um, what were the Nathan Adler diaries which preceded the album?
Well, the Nathan Adler Diaries was, I think, the public's first taste of that were Bowie's writings in British magazine Q, where the Adler Diaries was sort of revealed for the first time. The magazine had asked him to write something, and they were expecting like a diary or something, whereas what he presented was a work of morbid fiction. And that had grown out of the Leon Project. So he'd come up with this
Yeah,
concept, this art, ritual art, murder, art, crime concept, starting off with a 14-year-old girl, Baby Grace Blue, who was discovered torn apart and sort of publicly exhibited as a work of gruesome art in the middle of fictitious Oxford town. So the basic plot follows Detective Nathan Adler's investigation into the murder and all the sort of very suspicious characters that he came across during that.
yeah. So the album itself, the term nonlinear is highlighted in describing it. Is the text that was published in Q magazine also a nonlinear story?
It's pretty much identical to what was in the final album booklet, albeit with a few name spelling changes.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think his idea was to keep the listener or the reader intrigued, but never telling them the whole story.
Yeah, yeah. So with that said, what do you think the album is about?
It's you read the narrative and you expect the album to flow in a logical way, which of course it doesn't.
Yeah,
Um, so it does feel more like each song is a miniature sort of cinematic piece. Um, there's a very David Lynch feel to the whole thing, which was one of the influences at the time, obviously, with him having been in Fire Walk with Me. I think he subliminally carried over a lot of that sort of detective atmosphere into the story. So some songs point at potential suspects or explore, the victim, or every song on the album, when you examine the sleeve notes, has been assigned to a different character. So sung in the voice of Ramona A. Stone or Leon Blanc, and there's red herrings along the way. You try to present a traditional murder mystery, but it's done in such a way that it almost reflects his Burroughs cut-up lyric technique, where it's all
Yeah.
fragmented, and you really need to sort of listen through it over and over again before you can start to piece together little hints from different tracks if you want to actually follow the story. And of course, his other intention was that you can ignore the story completely and just enjoy the songs on the album.
Yeah.
Albeit out of context, they are some of his stranger songs, but I think they are also his most interesting.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Do you think the album is better with the segues, which are essentially spoken word connectors between the songs, or do you think it works better without them?
I think as a big fan of the album, I've always enjoyed them.
Yeah.
It's kind of the only thing that's sort of dated it a little bit in places, because otherwise I still think it sounds pretty good for its time. It still sounds very modern. I think a lot of people had a hang up about spoken interludes, yet on the final album there's only a very small number of them, whereas with the original Leon project, it was almost all spoken with virtually no traditional or conventional songs. It was
Yeah.
really going to be more a piece of audio theatre in a way, something
Yeah.
really different.
So I'm going to refer to another quote. This is not from your book, but from lyrics to one of the segues, which I'm referring to this because to me this sort of strikes at the heart of the project. So you'll recognize this right away. A person who loses a name feels anxiety descending, left at the crossroad between the centuries, a millennium fetish. And like, why am I throwing this out? How central do you think that is to unpacking the whole of the album?
I think that was a thread that was really running through the core because, you'd got a lot of pre-millennial tension back in 95,
Yeah,
I can't even remember whether the Millennium Bug was a thing yet then or not, but, there was a lot of sort of potential doom on the horizon when the year 2000 was going to arrive on calendars. So I
yes,
think, the story is set in on December 31st, 1999, so it's right at the turn of the century,
yeah,
almost as if as soon as the numbers change, chaos is going to happen.
right. Yeah, I think yeah, I agree with that. I think that the album speaks to the anxiety that was whether there was a consciousness of the idea of the Millennium Bug or not, there was certainly a conscious anxiety about the new millennium or the turn of the calendar. And you talked about how the reaction to the album has been mixed. And I don't know how much of that is because there's an anchor in this particular decade of the 1990s that the further we get from it, the harder it is for us to relate to that particular feeling.
Yeah, and of course now he's got several generations of fans who weren't even born then.
Yes, right.
Back then, the internet was still a new thing. It wasn't a household technology we have and take for granted today.
Yeah,
It was still very in its infancy. Um, and things like virtual reality and all that sort of thing, that was quite a recurring theme in
yeah,
in films. And even, even artists like Billy Idol had put out an album called Cyberpunk, which drew a lot on the sort of cyberculture and took inspiration from the William Gibson Neuromancer novel, which is quite a few parallels with Outside. And interestingly, that album was a bit of a failure, as were many of the films at the time. I think the public had got a bit bored with it quite quickly. So I
hmm
think Bowie's decision to, because Outside could have easily fallen into that category, and it does still get sort of categorized as that kind of pre-millennial tension album, which
yeah,
I've never, maybe because I'm so close to the album, never really thought about it that way, but I
Yeah.
think he managed to skirt it through, avoid it being trapped in that sort of cliche through adding the more traditional murder mystery storyline.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the internet, and in the book, you reference a famous interview that he gave to Jeremy Paxton,
Yeah.
where he talked about the internet in the 90s and remind us what he was basically saying and what the reaction was to what he was saying at the time.
Yeah, I can't quote it, but I do remember he refers to it as an alien life form at some point
Yeah,
in the interview. And that clip has gone viral so many times because what he was saying has come to pass.
right. Do you think that Outside is I don't want to say the first internet album, but do you think that there's a relevance to this album coming out around the same time that the internet became common, almost the same year?
But I think he was very interested in new technologies. And as we know, he was one of the first artists to really start embracing the internet. So I think it makes sense that it fueled his writing. Although, oh, interestingly, in a lot of the earlier material, there's a lot of reference to CD-ROM,
Hmm.
which, of course, until the internet came along, that was going to be the next big thing, which he'd already been sort of on the cutting edge with the Jump interactive CD-ROM, and they had plans for a more adventurous generative CD-ROM project that was going to tie into the Leon material. But of course, that never happened in the end. And CD-ROM technology, which at the time I remember it coming out, and you think, wow, this is great because you get an album or whatever, and it's interactive. You can explore stuff, you can watch interviews, not just a disc of music.
Yeah,
Um, but in those days, the content of a CD-ROM was not that much different to, what 10 years later, what a basic website would have had on it. So I think it was a pretty short-lived. So his decision to edit the references to CD-ROMs out of Outside just left it with internet references, which still feel relevant today. But back then, I think it was potentially the first album to explicitly reference the internet
yeah. So even that project, the CD-ROM was kind of a transitional technology, and there's a lot in this album that is stuck between stuff. Like we were just talking about the 90s, right? It's or the
yeah,
crossroad between centuries. But Ramona talks about eight men with metal parts, and then the Minotaur is not entirely human, not entirely
half man,
animal.
half beast. Yeah.
Yeah, and Bowie himself appears as different characters, right? He's not a man, he's not a woman, he's not old, he's not young. What's that all about? It's an ongoing theme of Bowie's, right? Being in transition or being in a liminal state, but how does this album embrace that theme?
I think it embraces it more because the characters that he was playing in this album were like putting on masks for acting purposes. It was
Hmm.
very different to his own personas of the past, where it was something for himself to get the confidence on stage or whatever it was that he needed to achieve by not being himself. Whereas this
Hmm.
time round, he was simply having great fun with it
Yeah.
as an actor. Um, and I think for a long time he'd wanted to do a performance piece, a bit of sort of rock opera. He tried to do the Diamond Dogs thing. He tried to do the 1984 musical. Um, he dabbled in film, so it had always been a long sort of time project that he'd been wanting to do. And I think there was supposed to be a theatre production with Outside and also
Hmm.
with Leon,
Yeah.
uh, both of which didn't happen. But it's also contained within the album because it is quite a theatrical album.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's these different characters, and near the end of your book, you consider all the songs on the album, and it reminded me that section of your book reminded me that all of the songs are assigned a character, including through these architects' eyes, which it's like I happen to really like that song. Nobody ever thinks of that song. I was glad to read that you also enjoy that particular song, but completely forgot that it was a signed character. So it seems like it's detached from the rest of the album, much as Strangers When We Meet seems to really be detached from the album. Those are, I think, the two last songs on the album. So my first question here is, what is the function that these characters play? Like you're describing them as characters like they're in a play. What but they serve specific functions. And what do you think he was trying to do with that?
I think what what he wanted to do was tell the story through the songs, but I think because of the difficulty he had with the record labels and Leon,
Yeah,
which was really a narrative character based piece where it was pretty obvious you were listening to different characters because he was really doing a lot of different voices and accents. That isn't so apparent on Outside. I think they really dialed that down
yeah,
for the album, which made it harder to follow the proposed storyline, if you like. So
hmm,
it's not at all obvious that certain songs are to be sung from the perspective of different characters. But once you realize that, I think you do sort of start to listen to them in a different way if you want to engage with the story. Um, when you do that, I think you also find there are little clues, because at the end of the album, you still don't know who murdered Baby Grace.
right,
But you do gradually, the more you play it with that mindset, you do sort of start to formulate a picture of what could be happening. And I think like you said, I do in the book have a breakdown of the songs, but I didn't want to try and interpret them myself. I think this is the job of the listener.
yeah,
Other books have done that very well. So I wasn't going to try and put myself in competition with that. But I think, yeah, there's a degree of explanation that's obvious in some songs, but I thought it would be much more interesting to look at the recording of them, how they came together, um, as a priority over interpretation. Because, like I said, I think I don't want to take the joy of interpretation away from who's listening to the album.
yeah,
I'd like to think that whoever might read my book is perhaps new to Outside. Could
yeah,
be a younger generation of fans that are just discovering his back catalogue, or fans that have reappraised it after a long time, or fans like myself that just want to know more about it.
yeah.
So I think that's what I wanted to achieve through doing that.
So all that said, what is Strangers When We Meet doing at the end of this album? It was also on the Buddha of Suburbia.
Yeah, well, he also I don't know what stage he got to with them, but he also re-recorded or considered re-recording several other songs from Buddha of Suburbia, including Dead Against It and Sex and the Church. And I think because Buddha was always one of his personal favorite albums, and it's actually one of mine, I think it's a fantastic record. Um, it didn't do well. It was pretty much a failure on release. It,
Yeah,
it was poorly marketed by the label. It was misfiled as a soundtrack in shops when it was not. And it was totally overshadowed by the release of the singles collection compilation like a week after it came out. So I think he felt that it didn't get the attention it deserved at the time. So his mind frame was very much, let's see what we can do with these songs and give them another lease of life. And out of that, I think Only Strangers When We Meet ended up on Outside, whereas the rest he obviously tried things with them, but I think for the better because it would have been a shame to have a lot of the same songs on two
right.
albums. Whereas what we have there is the only instance, as far as I can think, in his catalogue where you've got the same song on two subsequent albums.
Yeah, I live in the US, if you couldn't tell from the accent. And in 1993, I learned that there was this David Bowie album that I couldn't buy in the United States, which was the Buddha of Suburbia. It wasn't released in the United States until
No,
1995. And I ended up getting a copy from overseas. But then when I did, like you said, it's classified as a soundtrack. I thought the cover was about the show. The album cover was about the television show. It was not about the album.
the cover was
And
awful.
it
Yeah.
was awful. Yeah. If you buy it today, you have a cover featuring David Bowie that
Mm.
Frank Okenfelds took, that picture. And it has this sort of serene, contemplative feel to it, which was more consistent with the album. And I think it's like now that all of this exists at once, somebody who's just coming into David Bowie is more likely to find this album with less they approach it with more of an open mind or just without any preconceptions than we did at the time when we're being told it's a soundtrack album. And even, you know, outside had mixed reviews. The Buddha of Suburbia was treated like it was a side project, like it wasn't a real album, but it really is. And I'm doing too much talking, but your book spends a fair amount of time on this album because it's relevant to the story of One Outside. So
Absolutely.
fill in some of the blanks about that.
I mean, yeah, just going back to Buddha for a moment, it is a excellent album, and I remember when it came out, and I was one of those people that just saw it in the soundtracks
Yeah.
section of the music store and ignored it. Years later, and it was only when I got the first edition of Nicholas Pegg's complete David Bowie book,
Hmm.
his glowing review of it made me think, what am I missing here? Um, and this was, I think, back in 2000, maybe. I was quite a latecomer to that album, and it was just reading what Nick had wrote about it that I realized that I've got to get this. And finding it those years later was like Mission Impossible. I
Yeah.
went in every single local record shop I could find until eventually I did find one copy, but it was it was worth the hunt.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think with Buddha, what he did was he worked very fast. He wrote and recorded the whole thing within the space of about a week. Took longer to mix and master and everything, but he adopted a very similar working approach to what he had done with the Berlin albums, with Low Heroes and Lodger. And I think that put him back on a more creative sort of streak, and a more enjoyable way of working. Because also then, he brought Mike Garson back into the fold and he was still working with Erdal Kizilkay. And I think the choice of musicians was really crucial to that album. And he was thinking, okay, I've got a new old working method
Yeah.
and some great musicians. And that was really the sort of the turning point for him, I think, creatively after Black Tie White Noise, which was quite a commercial record.
Right.
So it's always felt like very much like a bridge between Black Tie and Outside.
Yeah. I even hear musical similarities that form that bridge, right? Like in Black Tie White Noise, the song Palace Athena
Mm.
is sort of previews what you're going to get on Buddha and Outside and even Earthling, right? That Palace Athena in my mind sounds like it's the cousin of Law, Earthlings on Fire from Earthling.
Yeah,
And there's a style of music that I almost feel like when you're listening to Diamond Dogs and it has Rebel Rebel that sort of reaches back to the glam period, and then it has 1984 that reaches forward to the more funky period of Young Americans. But anyway, we're not talking
I
about
think you
that.
find that with a lot of his albums. There's
Yes.
often one song that links to the previous,
Yeah.
and one song or even part of a song that will link to the next.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily apparent at the time.
So before um, the album One Outside was actually released, so we were talking about Buddha and how it was sort of mismarketed. And uh, possibly, let me ask you, do you think it was also a mistake to launch the tour, which you said is his best? I saw the tour in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was blown away. I thought it was terrific. Do you think it was a mistake to start the tour before the album was released?
I think it was quite a bold move. It's the
Mm,
sort of thing that you do see some artists doing these days, but it's still a bold move because a large amount of concert goers, they want familiar stuff.
yeah,
So what he was doing with the outside tour was not only was he not playing familiar stuff deliberately, but he was prioritizing new stuff that a lot of people hadn't heard. And yes, he started the tour in the US with Nine Inch Nails, which I think, that had its own challenges because you've got a lot of the Nin fans who were leaving after they
yes,
had their set, who are probably and hopefully forever kicking themselves. You know, who in their right mind walks out of a David Bowie concert, you know?
Yeah.
But at the
I saw
same
that with
time,
my own eyes. I was there to see David Bowie and all these. I was, this is 1995. So how old was I? I was 26. And I couldn't believe that large numbers of people that were younger than me were getting up and leaving after Nine Inch Nails left.
I think also back then he still hadn't he you know his career had been at a bit of a low at the end of the 80s, and he was dangerously venturing towards kind of has-been territory.
Yeah.
And the last thing he wanted to do was become a legacy act, and he was also a lot older.
Hmm.
By the time you get to 40, you're ancient in musical terms. Less so these days, but I think back in the mid 90s,
Yeah.
he was what in 95 he was 48. So I think there was a bit of musical ageism going on, as well as people that were just a bit not entirely familiar with what he would be doing or what he was about to do.
Yeah. So the outside tour was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, his first solo tour. So he toured with Tin Machine, but before that, his most recent previous solo tour was the Sound and Vision tour of 1990. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a greatest hits tour. And I have often wondered if, although that tour was very successful, if it actually hurt his career because it sort of cemented him as a legacy act. So by the time you get to Outside, there's that idea that he's past his relevant period. But you just talked about it's not even one Outside. He had already done the Buddha of Suburbia, which was kind of ignored, and Black Tie White Noise, which I don't think it's either of our favorite albums, but it was also post Sound and Vision tour, right?
Mm.
So do you think that tour did him reputational harm, even though it was successful?
At the time, I think it may have done, but I think you look at the Serious Moonlight tour, and the Glass Spider tour; they're quite similar.
Hmm.
Sound and Vision presented it in a very different way. There was a lot of new visual technology that I think was starting to creep into rock concerts in the early 90s. So he was
Yeah.
a forerunner with that sort of thing. But you listen to, I think interestingly, both the Outside tour and Sound and Vision tour have never had an official release,
Hmm.
on certainly on video. And in terms of the Sound and Vision tour, it never had an official audio release either. But I've heard bootlegs, and his voice didn't sound great. His high notes were gone. He was husky. I think years of whatever whatever he was abusing, or just relentless tour schedule, and a lot of hammer on his vocal cords by that point in his career had left him not sounding his best. Um, so 5 years later, he comes back, and I remember being amazed in the arena when the show opened, because you could hear him singing before you could see him. And I was always so surprised at how not only how good his voice sounded for real,
Yeah.
but it was higher than I was expecting, and it was just in such fine voice.
Yeah.
So I think he'd got married, he'd cleaned up his act, he'd had some rest, because he didn't tour Black Tie White Noise, because he never systematically toured every album.
Right.
Scary Monsters is often hailed as one of his greatest works, and he never toured that
Yeah.
exclusively. So I think, yeah, Sound and Vision, while it was probably a great show, it seemed a bit like an unnecessary legacy
Yeah.
thing, which was obviously in conjunction with the Riker disc reissues and all that sort of thing. But what I think it did do was it helped him wipe the slate clean to move on and do something new. But the problem when you think you're a successful artist and you've got a repertoire of amazing hits is that's just what audiences want. They don't want to know other stuff.
Yeah.
And I think as an artist, that must be so frustrating, because you want to be playing the sort of stuff that you're fired up and interested in at the time. You don't want to be forever playing something that's 10, 15 years old, and you want to be getting on with progress.
Yeah. I've had the good fortune of being able to see Paul McCartney a few times in recent years, and he always has a line when he introduces a new song where he says, "You all want to hear the old songs, and we want to play some of our new songs, and you might not want to hear this, but I don't care."
And
So,
that's almost exactly the attitude that Bowie went out with on the Outside tour,
yeah,
which is also why I think musically it was so successful because he was performing maybe 10 songs from the new album from Outside on the show, and he'd really carefully selected songs from his back catalogue that matched the atmosphere and style, even though he was rocking some of them up. Um, you hear stuff like Scary Monsters and Look Back in Anger, or even Andy Warhol.
yeah,
The treatment that he gave them really, really revamped them and made them sound more modern than ever, especially Moon Age Daydream, which is obviously an absolute classic that he brought into the fold. Um, and of course, he at the time it was like, oh, he's not playing the hits. Actually, yeah, he was playing singles. He was playing DJ. He was playing Boys Keep Swinging. He was playing Breaking Glass. All singles, just not big hit singles.
yeah,
And then, of course, there's Under Pressure, which was a number one single. So
yeah,
I think at the time there was a bit of a misconception about what he was doing. The emphasis always seemed to fall back on the fact that he wasn't playing Let's Dance and China Girl.
right,
It's
yeah.
like, come on, there's more to the man than this.
The Under Pressure was the first time that I uh, was aware who Gail Dorsey was, and I think that that's why he wanted to do that was to highlight her.
Yeah, I think she was a big fan of the song as well. So it
Yeah,
was, although that was the only song of the night that was a bit of a mismatch with the rest of it,
yeah,
it was
yeah,
still remember the huge roar of applause when they started it because it was so unexpected.
yeah.
And that was the first time he'd ever played it live on tour.
So you sort of alluded to some of the elements of why the concert from this tour worked for you, but why do you then say it's the best tour that he ever did, or the best concert you ever saw?
I think because he was so happy and satisfied with where he was creatively and artistically, and that really came across in his performance.
Yeah,
To me, I only saw the one show, so I have nothing to compare it against. But he just seemed to be in a really good place artistically,
yeah,
um, and I think the choice of songs. Because if I'm going to put a lot of my favorite Bowie songs on, they're actually not going to be the biggest hits. They're going to be the more obscure stuff. So the fact that he was choosing to play some of this stuff really appealed to me as well. It
yeah,
just matched my tastes, I guess.
yeah,
And I saw the reality tour, which yeah, it was an amazing night. It was a brilliant gig, but I didn't enjoy it as much as the outside tour. It was almost like watching a different artist entirely. His stage
yeah,
presence was completely different. Um, and that was very, very hits heavy. So it was like I've seen him at two ends of the spectrum there.
yeah,
Um, but I think for my own personal tastes and the way that I consider music as a fan, as an artist, and as a musician myself, I guess what he was doing in the mid 90s ticked and still ticks my boxes.
yeah. So your book, one of the things that struck me about it is that it's the book itself is not stuck in the 90s. It covers a sweep. It covers the lead up to the album, and then it continues to contemplate the legacy. It mentions
Mm.
some of the posthumously released live albums from the tour, and it even connects uh, One Outside to some of the later albums, including Black Star. Um, so the sweep of the book, it's a concise book, but it has a very broad sweep. How do you how do you research um, such a an expanse of time? How did you go about researching this book?
I think a lot of it had been sort of written
Yeah,
mentally over the years. I obviously gathered and collected stuff at the time, magazine reviews, interviews, stuff like that. It's always been something that I fell in love with the album the moment it hit the shelves.
Yeah.
Um, and I've never lost interest in it like I have with other albums. It's always just done something for me. And there's
Yeah.
always been not only a bit of mystery to it, but that nagging sense of unfinished business. Um, so I think a lot of it was sort of absorbed information for what I'd read over the years, whether it was in books, in magazines, online, my own personal recollections of sort of living through that time. Although I didn't want to write the book from my point of view, which the only thing from my perspective in there is the afterward.
Hmm.
Um, I thought I wanted to approach it from I'm not, I've, I've had a few books out. I still have a bit of imposter syndrome calling myself a writer because, I'm not an academic or a scholar or anything like that. I'm just a passionate fan and a creative person. I have many creative hats, and writing is one of them. It's something I enjoy doing. Um, so I think it was when I thought, I'd really like to do this, and with self-publishing being more widely available and better than it was a few years ago, I thought I've got the tools to do this in the way that I want to do it. I didn't have the time or the patience to sort of go down trying to find a publisher and then yada yada, all that sort of stuff. Because I also wanted to make it quite a visual book. So I wanted to
Yeah.
design it in a way that it feels like it's connected to the album. So research wise, it started off with sort of me just outpouring everything that I'd got in my memory and then getting boxes of old stuff down from the loft and looking through old interviews and all the stuff that I remember reading multiple times at the time, and then looking up, listening to the Leon recordings and listening to the album again and all the associated singles, just re-immersing myself in everything about it. Listening to the recent live album releases from the tour. Um, And I sort of started to get a picture of what I wanted to do. I thought, yeah, actually, I think I could write about the making of this album, how he got there, the album itself, and then obviously the tour, which is obviously linked very heavily to the album. And then I managed to start speaking with some of the people that worked with him, whether it was on the creative side or on as musicians in the studio or on tour.
Yeah.
Not especially extensively, but enough to make it feel valid and to clarify some things and also to get some other voices in there. So it just kind of started to grow and continued doing.
Were you able to make use of the archives that are available at the V&A Museum?
Yeah, and that's been just this last week. So this is a very much because I had, by all intents and purposes, kind of finished the book, but I
Yeah.
knew I had this visit to London coming, so I thought, yeah, this is the time to basically go and dive even deeper
Yeah.
into the world of Outside and Leon and see what I can find there. So yeah, I had spent the best part of a day sifting through files and boxes of endless notes, correspondence, all sorts of things from his personal archive from
Yeah.
that time, which was fascinating,
So you
really
mentioned
fascinating.
the yeah, I I haven't been able to visit London yet. I actually am hoping to later in the year. Um, but I could only imagine how fascinating those materials must have been. Um, so you mentioned the visual design of the book, which I think is beautiful. Uh, there's a coherence to it. It's not just that it has pretty pictures, though it does, but there's a coherence to the layout that I think is an asset. And that's part of what you do. You why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're a visual artist, you're a musical artist, you're not just a writer. Um, Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that David was the best art teacher I never had.
Yeah,
I work as a graphic designer, that's my main profession, but outside of that, I work as a science fiction illustrator. I make electronic music, and in recent years, I've kind of found myself writing stuff and having things published. Um, so that gave me the confidence to sort of take this on because obviously with anything like this, when you know you've got quite a hardcore fandom, it does feel like a bit of a risk. Yeah, I'm sure some people will hate it, but hopefully some people will like it as well.
Yeah.
But it was, I think, I didn't want to do just a textbook. I thought this has got to be, it's got to look like outside, but obviously in a way that I can get away with without breaching anybody's copyright. So things like the cover of the book cover, for example. I didn't want to just buy a stock photo of Bowie from the time and put his pretty face on the front because, yeah, it would look nice. It would also look a bit drab. It wouldn't stand out and it wouldn't necessarily look like the album.
Yeah.
Whereas I have a unique piece in my collection, which is this face
Yeah.
mask, which is a fiberglass cast of his face that was done for the film The Hunger in the early 80s. So it was done for his makeup. And a good friend of mine who works in film knew the guy that had got the mold, the original mold, and he took a new cast from it and sent it to me. Um, so I've had this thing knocking about for a while, and I suddenly thought, you know what, this could be an interesting cover image. My intention was never for it to look like a death mask or anything morbid, but when you consider the cover of Outside is Bowie's self-portrait of himself in death, and death is not only a theme that has run through so many of his songs, it's kind of central to the album. Yes, it's morbid, and yes, it's a bit sinister with the fact that he's no longer with us. It's not my intention to be morbid, it's my intention to do something that feels very outsidey and as dark and sinister as Outside was and still is. So I think we've got this, but I also made several different pieces of artwork for the inside of the book using different photographs of the face cast, which was just more for having something visual in there, which started off as breaker pages between the chapters. But then we've got other images as well. We've got some great illustration work inspired by the album by a friend of mine, Paul Thomas. And we've got some behind the scenes photographs from the studio shoot of the album. We've got some behind the scenes photos from in the studio. So there's a range of imagery in there, which I think is I hope people will enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I think it looks great. So let me
Thank you.
ask you this. I'm just going to ask you a couple last questions. Um, so we are recording this interview prior to the book's release. Hopefully it will have been released by the time you're watching the video. So
Fingers
how do
crossed.
you, yes, assuming that's the case, and if it's not, I will edit this part out, but if you're hearing it, how can people get the book?
It will be published via Amazon, so hopefully whichever country you're in, you'll be able to order a copy.
Yeah, great. And so let me wrap things up with a question, a variation of a question I end almost all my interviews with. I'm going to take for granted that your favorite Bowie album is One Outside, but if that's not the case, please correct me. But from the album, what's your favorite song?
I think my favorite song has evolved over the years. It's a tough one. It was We Prick You for a long time. It was I'm Deranged for a long time. I think if I was going to pick a song off it today, it would probably be Heart's Filthy Lesson.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Alex, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the book.
Thank
I
you,
always
John.
like talking about One Outside. And I enjoyed talking with you today. So I know we're going to stay in touch. And
It's been a pleasure.
yeah, thank you so much.
Cheers.